I always thought our house was too big for just the two of us. It's a standard mid-century suburban home in Austin, Texas, with a wraparound porch, a decent-sized backyard, and a living room that gets too much sunlight in the late afternoon. My husband Mark and I bought it 3 years ago, thinking we'd fill the empty bedrooms with kids by now. But life doesn't always follow the timeline you map out on napkins during your honeymoon. Instead, the extra space just became a monument to what we hadn't achieved yet. Mark works in corporate logistics, a job that keeps him glued to spreadsheets and late-night Zoom calls with overseas suppliers, while I manage a boutique marketing agency downtown. We were busy, comfortable, and quietly drifting into that dangerous phase of marriage where you become excellent roommates instead of lovers. We still said I love you before bed, but it felt like a habit, like locking the front door or checking the stove. It was routine. Then came Chloe. Chloe has been my best friend since our freshman year at Ohio State. She's the kind of person who commands a room without trying, possessing a chaotic, magnetic energy that either draws people in or burns them out. While I chose stability, Chloe chose adventure, moving from city to city, chasing jobs, relationships, and artistic phases that never quite panned out. When she called me crying from a diner parking lot outside of Houston, explaining that her latest relationship had ended in a spectacular, fiery breakup and she had nowhere else to go, my heart broke for her. I didn't even consult Mark before telling her to pack her bags and drive straight to our place. Mark was hesitant when I told him that evening. He likes his privacy and his routines, and the idea of a third person disrupting our quiet suburban life made him uneasy. But I insisted, telling him it was temporary. Just a few weeks until she found her footing. I wanted to be the savior. I wanted to feel that rush of doing something meaningful for someone I loved. The first few weeks were actually incredible. Having Chloe around breathed new life into our stagnant household. She slept on our massive sectional couch in the living room, transforming it into a cozy, albeit slightly messy, sanctuary of pillows and blankets. She would have dinner waiting for us when we got home from work, opening bottles of wine we'd been saving for special occasions, and filling the kitchen with the sound of laughter. For the first time in years, Mark was actually talking at the dinner table instead of staring at his phone. He laughed at her stories about her disastrous dating life, and she listened with genuine fascination as he explained the intricacies of global supply chains. I remember sitting there, watching them banter, feeling a profound sense of happiness. I had my husband, I had my best friend, and my home felt alive. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamics began to shift. The temporary arrangement started stretching into months. Chloe's job search was going nowhere, or at least she wasn't trying very hard. She began spending her days in her pajamas, lounging on the couch, watching reality TV, and waiting for us to return. I noticed that she started dressing differently around the house. The oversized college hoodies were replaced by silk camisoles and short running shorts. At first, I dismissed my discomfort as internalized jealousy or unnecessary prudishness. This was Chloe, after all. She had always been comfortable with her body, and we were all adults. But then I started noticing the small interactions between her and Mark. It started with the lingering glances. I'd catch Mark looking at her from across the kitchen island while she poured coffee, his eyes tracking the movement of her hips. When she laughed at his jokes, she would lightly touch his forearm, her fingers staying just a second too long. Mark, who was usually so rigid and private, didn't pull away. In fact, he seemed to lean into it. He started coming home earlier from work. He stopped working in his home office and began bringing his laptop to the dining room table, where he could see Chloe lounging on the couch. They developed inside jokes that I wasn't a part of, references to late-night conversations they'd had while I was asleep or at early morning gym sessions. I felt like a ghost in my own home, walking through rooms where the air felt thick with a tension I couldn't quite define. One Friday night, we were all sitting around the fire pit in the backyard. I had a pounding headache from a brutal week at the agency, and the alcohol was making my mind race. Mark and Chloe were sharing a blanket, laughing about something silly. I looked at them, sitting so close together that their shoulders were touching, and a cold wave of dread washed over me. I excused myself, saying I needed to go to bed early. I expected Mark to follow me, or at least offer to tuck me in, but he just nodded, his attention already snapping back to Chloe before I even reached the back door. I lay awake in our master bedroom for hours, listening to the muffled sound of their voices and laughter echoing from the yard. It was 2 in the morning when I finally heard the back door slide shut, followed by the quiet murmur of them saying goodnight in the hallway. The doubt began to consume me. I started checking Mark's phone when he was in the shower, feeling a sickening mix of guilt and desperation. There were text messages between them, mostly mundane things about groceries or dinner plans, but the tone was entirely too familiar. He used emojis with her that he never used with me. He asked about her day with a level of genuine curiosity that he hadn't shown me in years. When I confronted him one night in the privacy of our bedroom, asking if he thought Chloe had stayed too long, he got instantly defensive. He told me I was being paranoid, that Chloe was going through a hard time, and that throwing her out would be cruel. He accused me of being a bad friend. The intensity of his defense shocked me, and it only solidified the knot of suspicion tightening in my stomach. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday in mid-November. I was scheduled to fly to Chicago for a 3-day marketing conference, a trip I had been dreading because it meant leaving them alone together. The tension in the house had become unbearable, a silent, vibrating chord that none of us acknowledged. Mark drove me to the airport that morning. The ride was silent, the air filled with an awkward constraint. He kissed me goodbye at the curb, but his lips were cold, his eyes scanning the traffic behind me rather than looking at my face. I checked into my terminal, boarding the plane with a heavy, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. 2 hours later, as the plane touched down at O'Hare, I received an email from the conference organizers. The keynote speaker had tested positive for a highly contagious virus, and out of an abundance of caution, the entire event was being postponed and moved online. I stood in the crowded, chaotic terminal of the Chicago airport, staring at my phone, a strange, terrifying sense of clarity washing over me. I didn't call Mark. I didn't text Chloe. Instead, I walked straight to the customer service desk and booked the very next flight back to Austin. The flight back was the longest 2 hours of my life. My mind was a storm of worst-case scenarios, playing out scenes of betrayal on an endless loop behind my eyelids. I told myself I was crazy. I told myself I was going to walk through my front door, find Mark working at his desk and Chloe watching TV, and I would look like an absolute lunatic who blew thousands of dollars on a canceled trip just to spy on them. I wanted to be wrong. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that I was just a paranoid, insecure wife who was destroying her own happiness. By the time my rideshare pulled up to our house, it was just past 9 in the evening. The neighborhood was quiet, the street lamps casting long, eerie shadows across the wet pavement. The house was mostly dark, except for the dim, ambient glow of the living room television leaking through the front windows. My heart was hammering against my ribs so loudly I was certain the driver could hear it. I paid him, stepped out into the cool night air, and walked up the concrete driveway. I didn't use the garage door opener. I didn't want the loud mechanism to give away my arrival. Instead, I pulled my house keys from my purse, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them twice on the porch. I took a deep, shuddering breath, inserted the key into the lock, and quietly turned it, stepping into the dark entryway of my home. The house smelled like rain, melted candle wax, and the expensive bourbon Mark only brought out for special occasions. The TV was playing an old movie on mute, the blue light flickering across the entryway walls like a strobe. I carefully set my suitcase down on the hardwood floor, moving with a terrifying, silent precision I didn't know I possessed. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, thick, and suffocating. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, walk out the front door, get back into a cab, and pretend I never came home early. But my feet kept moving, drawn toward the living room by a sickening, magnetic certainty. As I cleared the entryway wall and looked toward the large sectional couch, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The blanket we had shared on the back porch was spread out on the floor, and sitting right in the center of the living room, completely exposed in the dim light of the television, were my husband and my best friend. They weren't just talking. Chloe was sitting on the edge of the coffee table, her back to me, her fingers laced tightly through Mark's hair. Mark was on his knees on the carpet in front of her, his head buried in her neck, his hands gripping her waist with a desperate, frantic intensity that he hadn't shown me in half a decade. I couldn't breathe. The air caught in my throat like broken glass. I stood there, frozen in the shadows, watching the man who had promised to love me forever look up at my best friend with absolute, unadulterated devotion. He was whispering something to her, his voice muffled against her skin, but I could hear the desperate edge to it. He was telling her how long he had waited for this, how hard it had been to pretend while I was in the house, how much he loved the way she smelled. Every word felt like a physical blow to my chest, shattering the fragile reality I had built around my life. Then Chloe spoke. Her voice was low, breathless, completely devoid of the guilt or hesitation I would have expected from someone destroying her closest friend's life. She told him to hurry, reminded him that they didn't have much time before I'd be calling to check in for my hotel in Chicago. She laughed, a tiny, breathy laugh that made my stomach violently churn. Mark didn't hesitate. He pulled her closer, his lips moving down her collarbone, his hands sliding up under her silk camisole. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the expensive vase on the hallway table, to throw things, to rip them apart. But instead, a cold, dead numbness settled over me. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket, the sudden buzz sounding like a chainsaw in the quiet room. Both of their heads snapped toward the entryway. In an instant, the spell was broken. The romantic, illicit fog they were wrapped in dissolved into pure, unadulterated panic. Mark scrambled backward on the carpet, his face turning a ghostly, asymmetric white as his eyes locked onto mine. Chloe froze, her hands dropping to her lap, her mouth slightly open in shock. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody said a word. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the frantic, shallow breathing of the two people who meant the most to me in the world. Mark was the first to move. He tried to stand up, but his knees seemed to fail him, and he ended up awkwardly stumbling forward, reaching out a hand toward me as if I were a ghost he could pass right through. He started stammering, his voice cracking, trying to piece together words that didn't exist. He said my name over and over again, a useless chant, before finally managing to say that it wasn't what it looked like. It was the most cliché, pathetic sentence he could have possibly uttered, and hearing it come out of his mouth made me want to laugh hysterically. Chloe didn't say anything at first. She slowly slid off the coffee table, pulling her clothes tight around herself, her eyes darting between me and the front door, as if calculating her escape route. The magnetic, confident woman who had dominated my household for months suddenly looked incredibly small, cheap, and fragile. She looked like a thief caught with her hands in the safe. I stepped out of the shadows and into the flickering light of the television. I didn't cry. My eyes felt entirely dry, burning with a strange, clinical heat. I looked at Mark, looking down at his disheveled hair, his unbuttoned shirt, and the sheer, pathetic terror radiating from his posture. I asked him how long it had been going on. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was entirely calm, flat, and hollow, like a recording played in an empty room. Mark started crying, actual tears welling up in his eyes as he took another step toward me, trying to grab my hands. I stepped back, avoiding his touch as if he were covered in venom. He begged me to listen, swearing on his life that tonight was the first time anything had actually happened. He said they had just been talking, that things got out of hand, that he was confused and lonely and stressed about work. He piled excuse upon excuse, each one more pathetic than the last, trying to build a wall of justification to protect himself from the wreckage he had created. I turned my gaze to Chloe. I wanted to see a shred of remorse in her face. I wanted to see the girl who had held my hair back when we were 19, the girl who had given a toast at my wedding and promised to always look out for us. But all I saw was a desperate, self-preservation instinct. She finally spoke, her voice trembling but defensive. She said she was sorry, that she never meant to hurt me, but that Mark and she had developed a connection that neither of them could control. She actually used the word connection. It felt like a physical slap. She was trying to romanticize her betrayal, trying to turn her cheap backyard theft into a tragic love story. The sheer delusion of it broke something inside me. The numbness receded, replaced by a roaring, white-hot rage that filled my ears like the sound of an oncoming train. I told Chloe to get out. I didn't shout, but the quiet intensity of my voice made her flinch. I told her she had 10 minutes to pack whatever could fit into her car, and that if she wasn't gone by then, I would throw everything she owned out onto the wet driveway and call the police. She looked at Mark, silently begging him to defend her, to tell her she could stay, to protect her. But Mark wouldn't even look at her. He was too busy staring at me, his face twisted in desperate pleading, entirely focused on saving his own skin. Seeing him completely abandon her the second the stakes got high was a twisted form of justice, but it brought me no joy. It just showed me how ugly and cowardly the man I loved truly was. Chloe realized she was entirely on her own. Without another word, she gathered her blanket, scrambled up the stairs to the guest room, and began frantically throwing her life back into her suitcases. Left alone in the living room with Mark, the silence returned, heavier this time. He sank into the sectional couch, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, and asked me what we were going to do. He asked if we could talk, if we could go to counseling, if I could ever find it in my heart to forgive him. He said he would do anything, absolutely anything, to fix this. I looked around the room, at the home we had built, at the furniture we had chosen together, at the life I thought was safe. It all felt like a movie set, a cheap imitation of a reality that never existed. I didn't answer him. I walked past him, heading toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, my mind completely blank as I waited for the sound of Chloe's car driving away into the Texas night. The sound of Chloe's Honda Civic engine cranking in the driveway was the loudest noise I'd ever heard. Through the kitchen window, I watched her headlights cut through the dark, rainy night as she backed out onto the street, tires spinning slightly on the wet asphalt before she disappeared around the corner. She didn't look back. She didn't say goodbye. She just fled into the darkness, leaving behind the wreckage of the only real friendship she had left. I stood by the sink, holding a glass of water I had no intention of drinking, my hands finally stopping their violent shaking. The house felt lighter with her gone, but it wasn't a relief. It was the emptiness of a vacuum. Mark was still sitting on the sectional in the living room, his head in his hands, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He looked like an old man, defeated and broken, stripped of the corporate confidence he usually wore like armor. When he heard my footsteps returning to the room, he looked up, his eyes rimmed with red, desperate for any sign of mercy. He started talking immediately, a frantic torrent of words, as if he believed that stopping the silence would stop the inevitable. He told me that Chloe had manipulated him. He claimed she had been making subtle advances for weeks, dropping hints while I was at work, sitting too close to him when they were alone, creating an environment where he felt trapped. He was trying to rewrite history, trying to turn himself into the victim of a predator rather than a willing participant in his own betrayal. Hearing him pass the blame to her was pathetic. It made me realize that the man I married wasn't just unfaithful, he was a coward. I sat down in the armchair opposite the couch, keeping a deliberate, clinical distance between us. I told him to shut up. The word was sharp, cutting through his rambling excuses like a knife. He stopped instantly, his mouth half open, watching me with a fearful intensity.
I asked him for the truth, not the sanitized version he was trying to manufacture to save his ego. I wanted to know when it really started. I wanted to know how many times they had laughed at me behind my back, how many times they had touched while I was in the next room, how deep the rot actually went. He broke down completely then, the tears streaming down his face as he confessed. It hadn't started tonight. The tension had been building for months, fueled by late-night conversations over wine while I was asleep upstairs. He admitted that they had kissed for the first time 3 weeks ago, right in our kitchen, while I was out getting groceries. He confessed to a dozen small moments of intimacy, holding hands under the table, lingering hugs in the hallway, text messages sent from his office desk while he pretended to be working late. Every admission was a fresh tear in the fabric of my memories, altering the past until my entire marriage felt like a hallucination. The worst part wasn't the physical aspect of it. It was the emotional theft. He admitted that he had complained to her about me. He had told my best friend that he felt lonely, that he felt like I was too focused on my career, that our marriage had lost its spark. He had handed her the weapon to destroy me, using our private vulnerabilities as currency to buy her affection. I felt a wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the armrests of the chair to keep from getting sick.
My husband had taken the intimate, sacred struggles of our life together and shared them with the woman who was supposed to be my sister. He slid off the couch and onto his knees again, crawling across the carpet toward my chair, begging for forgiveness. He grabbed the hem of my jeans, his voice cracking into a sob as he told me he loved me, that he had made the biggest mistake of his life, but that he couldn't lose me. He said he would sell the house, that we could move to a different city, start completely over, go to marriage counseling every single day if that's what it took. He begged me not to throw away 5 years of marriage for a momentary lapse in judgment. I looked down at his face, searching for the man I had stood at an altar with, the man who had promised to protect my heart above all else. But that man was gone, replaced by a stranger who had looked me in the eye and lied to me for weeks. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't a choice you just made, it was a physical impossibility. The bridge between us hadn't just been damaged, it had been blown to pieces, and there was no rebuilding it from the ashes. The night stretched on into the early hours of Wednesday morning, a blur of crying, begging, and agonizing silence. I didn't go to bed. I stayed in that armchair, watching the clock on the wall tick away the minutes until dawn, while Mark eventually collapsed from exhaustion, sleeping fitfully on the floor near my feet like a punished dog.
The blue light of the television finally faded as the sun began to rise, casting a gray, cold light across the living room. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside looking washed out and dead. When the clock struck 7, I stood up. My body was stiff, every muscle aching from the tension of the last 10 hours. Mark woke up instantly, scrambling to his feet, his face puffy and disoriented. He asked me what I was doing, his voice hoarse and trembling. I didn't look at him as I walked toward the front hallway. I grabbed my car keys from the table, opened the front door, and looked out at the quiet suburban street. I turned back to him, standing in the center of the ruined living room. I told him that I was going to an extended stay hotel downtown for the rest of the week. I told him that he had until Sunday evening to pack his things and leave the house. I told him that my lawyer would be contacting him on Monday morning with divorce papers, and that if he tried to call me, text me, or show up at my hotel, I would file for a restraining order immediately. He started to protest, stepping toward me with his hands raised in a desperate appeal, but the cold, dead look in my eyes stopped him in his tracks. He saw the finality in my expression, the absolute certainty of a woman who had already processed her grief and turned it into steel. He let his hands fall to his sides, a fresh wave of quiet tears spilling over his cheeks as he realized that his life as he knew it was officially over. I walked out the door, shutting it firmly behind me, and stepped into the crisp morning air, leaving the ghost of my marriage behind in the quiet house. The downtown hotel room felt like a sterile, expensive glass cage. It was located on the 16th floor, overlooking the concrete veins of the city, completely removed from the quiet, tree-lined suburban streets of my old life. For 4 days, I stayed inside that room, watching the sun rise and set over the skyline, the constant hum of city traffic below acting as a white noise machine for my grief. I didn't cry as much as I thought I would. Instead, I felt a deep, heavy exhaustion that settled into my bones. I spent my time staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last few months, dissecting every conversation, every glance, every subtle shift in my home, until my brain felt completely bruised. Mark respected the boundary I set, or perhaps he was just too terrified to break it. He didn't call and he didn't text, though my phone remained a constant source of anxiety, sitting silently on the glass desk. On Friday afternoon, a delivery courier brought a large manila envelope to my room. Inside was a key to the house and a brief handwritten note from Mark. His handwriting was shaky, barely legible in some places. He wrote that he had packed everything he owned and moved into a temporary corporate apartment near his office. He said he wouldn't fight me on the divorce, that he would sign whatever papers my lawyer drew up,
and that he was deeply, profoundly sorry for ruining the best thing that had ever happened to him. Reading it brought no satisfaction, no closure, just a dull ache of finality. By Sunday evening, the rain had returned to the city, a steady, rhythmic tapping against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel room. The time had come to go back. I packed my small suitcase, checked out of the hotel, and took a rideshare back to the suburbs. The drive felt surreal, like traveling backward through time to a place that no longer existed. When the car pulled up to the house, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had a week ago. The lawns were perfectly manicured, the street lamps flickered to life in the twilight, and neighboring houses glowed with the warm, inviting light of families preparing for the upcoming work week. But my house was completely dark, a black hole in the middle of the street. I walked up the porch stairs, my boots clicking softly against the concrete. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, bracing myself for the scent of bourbon and candle wax that had haunted my memories. Instead, the house smelled entirely of nothing. It was cold, clean, and completely empty. I flipped the light switch in the entryway, the sudden brightness revealing a pristine, hollow living room. The large sectional couch was exactly where it belonged, the pillows neatly arranged, the coffee table cleared of any clutter. Mark had hired a professional cleaning service before he left, wiping away every physical trace of the betrayal, as if scrubbing the floors could erase the memory of what had happened on them. I walked through the rooms, exploring the empty spaces. Mark's closet in the master bedroom was completely bare, nothing left but a few plastic hangers rattling against the metal rod. The guest room, where Chloe had stayed, was completely stripped, the mattress bare, the closet doors wide open. They were gone, both of them, scrubbed out of my life like grease stains. I sat down on the edge of my bed, looking out at the dark backyard where we used to have bonfires, where laughter used to echo into the night. The silence in the house was absolute now, no longer heavy or suffocating, just vast and empty. Tomorrow morning, I would meet with my lawyer downtown to sign the initial divorce filings. In a few months, the paperwork would be finalized, the assets would be split, and this house would be sold to some young couple looking to fill the empty bedrooms with children and dreams. My life had been completely derailed in the span of a single Tuesday night, shifted onto a track I never anticipated walking. But as I sat there in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, listening to the rain fall softly against the roof, the roaring rage and the crushing weight of the betrayal finally began to subside, leaving behind a strange, fragile sense of peace. I was alone, heartbroken, and facing a completely unknown future. But for the first time in years, I was living in the truth.